Joining me to discuss Pakistan's parliamentary elections is Mr. Reza Rumi, a political analyst, journalist, and visiting professor at Cornell University. He joins me via Skype from Islamabad, Pakistan. Mr. Rumi, thank you so much for joining us on the broadcast. My understanding is that there are close to about 11,000, maybe about 12,000 candidates running in Pakistan's election, among them an unprecedented number of Islamic extremists and sectarian groups. Mr. Rumi, what can you tell us about these candidates?
So basically this election is quite peculiar in the sense that the three ultra-right groups are contesting elections, and all three are from different sectarian background, and of course their views are extreme. And their sort of rhetoric is very hardline. But this move is being seen as an effort to mainstream some of these groups into the electoral process and in a way democratize them and make them part of the political mainstream. That's what the state perhaps thinks. But of course, there's the other opinion which says that this is very, very dangerous, that without demobilizing these groups and without taking an assurance that they would give up support for violence, it may be
Okay, we lost him. Okay. Yep, absolutely. Yep. Can you talk to him?
Hello? Now I hear you.
Yeah, your video has frozen, so let our folks in Virginia Beach here hold on a second. Let's try to reconnect with you. Joining me to discuss Pakistan's parliamentary elections is Mr. Reza Rumi, a political analyst, journalist, and professor at Cornell University. He joins me via Skype from Islamabad, Pakistan. Mr. Rumi, thank you for joining us on the broadcast. My understanding is that there are close to about 11,000, maybe about 12,000 candidates running in Pakistan's parliamentary elections. Among them are an unprecedented number of Islamic extremists and sectarian groups. What can you tell us about these candidates?
Yeah, as you rightly said, this is quite a peculiar election where a large number of Islamic parties from the ultra-right are contesting the election. And the peculiar thing is that all the three major groups have different sectarian backgrounds. And this way, this is going to be a very strange kind of electoral exercise where you have people making a choice whether they are adhering to the extremist ideology. But let's see what happens. In general, the Islamists in Pakistan have never done well in the election. And that's one major argument for supporting the fact that the Pakistani people in general do not adhere to extremist opinions or ideologies. But this election is to be sort of still seen as to where it will play out. But there is one school of thought here which also supports this mainstreaming exercise because they feel that to reintegrate some of these Islamist or ultra-extremist groups back into the electoral or the mainstream democracy may democratize them and neutralize them in a way. But there is another school of thought which says, well, until you don't demobilize such cadres and make sure that they do not support any kind of violence, this is a dangerous sign and exercise for the future of democracy.
One of the most prominent individuals on the campaign trail is Hafiz Mohammed Saeed, the accused mastermind behind the 2008 Mumbai terrorist attacks. The United Nations, as you know, sir, has declared him a terrorist, and the U.S. has a $10 million bounty for him, yet he is openly campaigning. Why is the government allowing this? In fact, just at a recent campaign rally in Faisalabad, he said that Jews, Crusaders, and Hindus are targets. They are at war against these three religions.
Well, first, let me clarify that Hafiz Saeed himself is not contesting the election.
That's correct.
And in fact, his supporters in large numbers are either running as independents or have joined another party, largely defunct party. So technically speaking, they are not running in the election from Hafiz Saeed's platform. Secondly, Hafiz Saeed, the view in Pakistan, in sections of Pakistani, policy circles and media even, is that he has still not been convicted in a court of law, which proves beyond reasonable doubt that he is guilty of the charges leveled against him. It is not fair to completely ban him from his charitable activities, because he has a large charity network. So there is this argument which has strong traction in Pakistan. As regards the rhetoric, I agree with you that the rhetoric of all Islamists is dangerous for the society where they actually preach such ideas. But then we do have a global rise of the right kind of a problem everywhere in the world, where the extreme groups and hate speech and extreme narratives are on the rise, and Pakistan sadly is no exception.
What's the likelihood that the participation of these many radical groups could lead to the further radicalization and mainstreaming of terrorists in Pakistan?
I frankly do not, have a very clear view on this, because I think that there are pros and cons of this approach. For one, they may influence mainstream politics, but they may also be influenced by the necessity to adhere to laws and regulations, electoral rules, and the rules with which a democracy works. So from being completely out of the bounds of law militias, they may turn into somewhat more regulated entities with a political message. So that's where I think that there is some value in giving these groups some chance, because what can Pakistan do? I mean, there are thousands of them, and the state of Pakistan cannot kill them all, even though that is advocated by war mongers everywhere. I think we have to do something about these militants and these extremists if we want to either correct them or give them an opportunity to reintegrate into society. So if these groups want to exercise clout, it rather be democratic or electoral than with guns or armed methods. So I think it deserves a chance.
When you talk about giving these groups a chance, many of these extremist candidates seem to be saying to the present government and to the society that the government thus far or the society hasn't done enough to Islamize Pakistan and to convey the tenets of the faith in a sort of puritanical, conservative, ultra-conservative way. Is that the sort of platform that these groups are running on, where Sharia law, the strict Islamic interpretation of the faith, is practiced? Is that the platform that they're running on?
I think they are running on a very mixed platform. Of course, what you just said about this further Islamization of the state and society is, of course, everybody's agenda, and every group is competing on that plank. But, voters and people know that this is easy rhetoric, because Pakistanis have been long subjected to such narratives, not just by these groups, but also mainstream political parties in Pakistan use the religion card and Islamist, themes in their manifestos, in their speeches, in their electoral conduct. So I think that is not really the only platform that they're running on. They are also talking about water crises. They're also talking about health and education, on the state of services, because ultimately they have to connect with the voters and Pakistani voters largely vote on material issues.
How much influence does the military and intelligence services have in the election and possibly the outcome of next week's election?
So there is an intense debate going on within Pakistan at the moment as we speak, where a group, the media stands disunited. One section of the media are, complaining that there is muzzling and interference by the military and the intelligence agencies, and that there is censorship and encouragement to self-censorship. And the other group within Pakistani media industry holds, well, these are exaggerated claims, and there are no stringent forms of censorship going on in the country. And the reality is that there's no official declared policy of censorship. A lot of censorship that is happening is actually self-censorship that the journalists, the media owners, television show anchors are exercising, mainly not to cross, some lines with respect to the military and the judiciary. You see, Pakistan's constitution limits freedom of expression when it comes to the army, the courts, and the faith. So you cannot really be too critical about these three different areas according to the Pakistani constitution and the laws. And the state knows it, and the media owners and practitioners also know it. So there is a state of semi-controlled media expression and media narrative. But on the other hand, it is kind of difficult to determine how much of it is actually through external interference and how much of it is self-censorship. I adhere to the latter. As an editor myself, I do self-censor and try not to cross the lines, because I don't want my colleagues to be hauled in a contempt of court case, or become a target of the law enforcement agencies. So we have to also think of journalist safety when we exercise such controls.
In light of this, as an editor at a newspaper, a prominent newspaper, how free and fair do you think the election will be?
So, see, I think the polling day on the 25th is what will actually, tell us how fair or unfair it may be. Thus far, I think it is very difficult to do any kind of rigging or manipulation on the polling day in today's Pakistan. First of all, the Election Commission has, upgraded its systems and procedures in the past few years. So it's a pretty modernized system of election, management. At the same time, there is a large, expanded media with 90 plus TV channels and 500 publications, and not to forget the new media technologies. Millions of Pakistanis are online, especially in urban Pakistan, and it is very difficult to actually, even if somebody wants to rig, it is very difficult. But there have been complaints of pre-poll manipulation, and there has been some pressure on the outgoing ruling party of the former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, where some of its members were intimidated and asked to quit the parties. But it's not as widespread and as pervasive, which may make the entire exercise illegitimate. I think it is done selectively, and it's pretty sort of low to medium scale.
As you know, there is a viewpoint in Pakistan that the military, the intelligence services, is using these extremist radical groups as a way to draw vote away from the former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, because he was a controversial figure. He was just arrested a few days ago after arriving from London, charged on corruption charges and so forth. The sense that, as you know, he was controversial because he wanted civilian rule to exert more control inside Pakistani society as opposed to military rule. What do you make of this argument that these extremist groups, that the military is using these extremist radical groups to take votes away, potential votes away from his party and prevent him from becoming the next prime minister and his party gaining more seats in the parliament?
So I think, yes, I mean, there is a clear history of, this tug of war between former Prime Minister Mr. Sharif and the military establishment. But definitely that is one of the reasons that he's out and in jail today. There can be no, denial of that. But I think this mainstreaming of religious extremists is only partially driven by this factor, because there are, as I mentioned, all sorts of different groups in the electoral fray, and not all of them have been supporting the former Prime Minister Sharif's party. Some of them were not supportive of Sharif. The large groups were. And I think that is one of the factors which is at work here. The other factor is what I mentioned earlier about the mainstreaming and an attempt to politically integrate some of these Islamist groups so that they start, kind of democratizing themselves or getting under some regulatory umbrella than just being totally out of control militias.
How would you assess, as somebody who has watched Pakistani politics for a very long time, how would you assess Pakistan's transition from a military dictatorship run for decades by a military strongman, its transition to democracy, to the democratic values and principles? How would you assess, in light of this election and the politicking that's been taking place, the campaigning, how would you assess Pakistan's transition to a democratic political system of governance?
So basically, the current transition has been underway exactly for a decade now. In 2008, General Musharraf, who was the last military dictator, left power, and thereafter, the civilian government started exercising powers, and then there was another civilian government. So in a way, this is actually a real kind of benchmark for democratic evolution in Pakistan. It's the third time that an election is being held. And there will be a third transfer of power, peaceful transfer of power, in August. Generally, in Pakistan's history, no democratic governments in the earlier era were able to either complete their terms or transfer power to another democratic government. So in that sense, this is a kind of a new development, and Pakistan and this democracy has teething problems, both on the side of a Praetorian state represented by the civil military bureaucracy, but on the other hand, also the problems that emerge from the political system and political parties, especially from within. They are dynastic. They are not democratic structures themselves. They're largely family-based entities. They do not hold internal elections within the parties. I mean, they have a long way to go and evolve into effective political, instruments or areas which support the evolution of democracy. So in that context, I am pretty positive about Pakistan's democratic future, because I think it is slowly but surely getting there. And most democracies, even in the West, have undergone these phases and cycles for decades, if not for centuries, to come to a functional and workable democratic system. So Pakistan would also need some more time for these institutions and values to deepen.
As you know, the U.S. State Department here has expressed its deep concerns about these various extremist groups that are campaigning in this parliamentary election. As you know, the U.S. has given billions of dollars of aid to Pakistan since 9/11. Should that aid continue in light of the various political challenges in Pakistan, and especially in light of these extremist groups running in parliamentary elections?
Well, I mean, I think that is a complicated question, because I think there are two aspects to it. First, that yes, this is a danger sign. Even Pakistanis and Pakistani civil society are worried about this development, and even other political parties have been expressing their concern. The Senate in Pakistan, the senators, also spoke about that the day before, and everybody's worried about that. And I think U.S. State Department therefore also picks up these local kind of discussions and tremors and concerns, and also looks them through U.S. security interests prism, which has to do with both Afghanistan and the fact that U.S. would like the nuclear Pakistan to be a stable and a moderate state. So that's understandable. And I think as regards the military aid is concerned, I think under President Trump, aid has already been decreasing. I think the civilian aid is almost over. And the military aid has been in doldrums anyway. So the State Department's warning, to be honest, if it is going to be a lever in terms of aid disbursement or aid allocations, but Pakistan knows that that's not the case, and the U.S. leverage in Pakistan has been shrinking, partly because of Pakistan's embrace of China, which is the rising economic power and is investing in Pakistan heavily, and partly also due to the fact that the U.S.-Pakistan relationship has, I think, kind of become really exhausted and strenuous over the years due to fundamental differences of aims in Afghanistan.
Is that a good thing? Should the U.S., you say the U.S. does no longer have sort of an economic leverage. Is that a good thing? Should the U.S. exert more leverage?
I think that the United States, I would not say that it should exert any lever or leverage, but I would say that the U.S. needs to remain engaged in Pakistan for a variety of reasons. And I think that is why, despite so much heat and heated statements, the relationship still continues. And that is because in the U.S. troops in Afghanistan and the future of Afghanistan, everybody now knows involves Pakistan, and without Pakistan, there can be no viable long-term solution to Afghanistan after the U.S. exits the place. And the U.S. would want to avoid another Iraq. So therefore, a relationship with Pakistan makes a perfect rational sense. As regards how to influence Pakistan, I think the US needs to engage Pakistan and take into view its security concerns, its anxieties, real or imagined paranoia about India, etc., which is now a strategic ally of the US, and perhaps enter into a composite dialogue, a multi-tracked dialogue, and must not resort to this name calling, because that has a negative impact on Pakistani public opinion, and then it pushes the government or the military to act more kind of anti-American. And so, it's a two-way street. Let's not forget that. I mean, Pakistan is not a small state. It's a country of 200 million people, and it is a nuclear state. And despite all these various predictions in the last 20 years that Pakistan is going to collapse, or it's a failed state or a failing state, the reality is that Pakistan is a very much functional state, and its state has certain priorities, which often come into conflict with those of the US and the Western world. And how do we go about that? I guess that can best come through engagement, dialogue, and finding common ground, and then working on that.
A final question: if you were to make a prediction, who do you think will win?
So it is again, most predictions and polls in recent weeks have indicated a hung parliament, which means that no single political party may have sufficient majority to form a government on its own, so it may have to find coalition partners. But the party of the former cricketer Imran Khan seems to be ahead of all others, and it is widely anticipated that his party would do well. It may not get sufficient seats to form a government on its own, but it will find allies and maybe form the next government.